Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We appreciate you spending time with us today. So welcome to another CIQ webcast. We today are going to talk more about Singularity, but today we have an exciting and interesting crew. We are bringing in people who actually have done the work, used the product, and are involved in the community. So it's nice to hear real world examples and from these guys who are actual scientists and are here as a part of the CIQ team. So today we have, as always, Greg Kurtzer, got Dave and Glenn. So Dave and Glenn are both fairly new to CIQ. Glenn's extremely new. So why don't you guys introduce yourselves? Greg, I'll save you for last because I think most people should know who you are by now. But Dave, introduce yourself again.
Hey everybody, I'm Dave Godlove. I have worked at the NIH for the past 2 years. Before that, I helped Greg found Scilabs and was the community manager / release manager for Singularity, now Apptainer. And previous to that, I was also at the NIH for another 2 years, working at the internal cluster BioWolf.
Very nice, thank you. Glenn, welcome.
Hi, Glenn Otero. Like David was trained as a scientist long ago. I've been working in bioinformatics and HPC for a little over 20 years, about the same amount of time I've known Greg. And what else? Yeah, recently, I worked with a lot of people when I was at Dell, when I was at TGen and other places to help them design clusters for genomics and bioinformatics workflows. And that's what I do best. I make things go fast. So, and I'm a real hacker because I have a Monty Python mug. Oh, you probably can't see that with the.
Oh, there you go. Nope, but it's in front of your shirt. It works. There you go.
The velocity, unladen swallow. Okay, so I'm a real hacker because I have a Monty Python quote lying around. So
very nice. And of course, Greg.
Hey everybody. I too am in science first and foremost in my career, but unlike these two guys that are smarter than me, and Zane, of course, Zane as well, but they have PhDs, and I didn't quite finish my PhD, so I'm going to hide here in the corner and let these guys talk for the majority of this.
You can't hide for too long, Greg, because I think I would like to level set a little bit and just take a few minutes for those who haven't done this before and just kind of level set of what Singularity is. And then I have another question that's come up that's a really good question about the Linux Foundation. But if we could start off and just tell us a little bit, what is Apptainer? Kind of where did it come from? How is it different than Podman, Docker, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. So just as a quick kind of historic relevance and how we got here, a number of years ago, man, Dave and I used to talk about this constantly as we talk about it. It used to be like, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. I think now we're like 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago. Customers and researchers and scientists started getting wind of this new idea called containers. And I got it a lot from UC especially. So I was joint appointment from Berkeley Lab, DOE, as well as UC OP, specifically on appointment with UC Berkeley. And I got constantly, we had, people coming at, science initially from the long tail. So it was like political science. It was library science and others that you never would have thought would be high performance computing consumers started asking us about, like, can we go run this operating system, or can we do this differently? And if you just supported containers, all of this would be so easy. So we started looking at how do we incorporate containers into high performance computing. And the first thing that we found is the existing container ecosystem is really designed to solve a problem around services and root running services in particular. And that didn't really fit well for the architecture that we were using for high performance computing, which is the traditional BeowulF, and where you can have any number of users on your system at any given point. And if you give any of them access to a root running service, technically that's a security breach. So we had to figure out how to solve that. And that's actually what caused me originally to prototype Singularity. And within 6 to 8 months, Singularity was used on the majority of high performance computing systems worldwide. It took off massively fast. As Dave mentioned, we created a company called Scilabs, focused on that. When myself, Dave included, as well as others, left Scilabs, we took the open source Singularity project out of the company, and we brought it with us to ensure that it's going to stay in the community. And keep continuing down that vein. What we decided is, the best way to ensure that this stays open source and has a very long life ahead of it, and cross-pollinates with various other aspects in the community, specifically around OCI, the Open Containers Initiative, and the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. It makes a lot of sense to move this into the Linux Foundation, and that's where we had conversations about that. And the one request that Linux Foundation had, they were very excited about the prospect of moving this in, and everyone was unanimous on this. But the one request that they had is, please rename it. There's Singularity as a term, as a search term, is just it's used too often. It's all over the place, and it's too difficult for them to protect the brand of the project and protect the project itself. So they asked for a new name, something that's unique. And so we put that back out to the community. The community came back and said, after a vote of about 50 people who said they wanted to be part of that process, that Apptainer was the name we ended up going with, and that's where we are today.
And I feel like I say this every time. I always revert back and say Singularity. So I'm still trying. I'm getting better.
We all do. I do the exact same thing.
Painful. So whenever you talk about the Linux Foundation, that was one of the questions that came up that's really interesting to me, is what are the requirements that the Linux Foundation has, or what do they place in a project before it will sponsor it, or as a part of that process?
So there wasn't a huge amount, aside from the fact that it is truly a community. It's not corporate controlled, and if it is corporate controlled, they ask that it comes out of the company and goes into the Linux Foundation. But we basically assign all aspects of the project to the Linux Foundation. So the Linux Foundation is the owner of the project. And trademarks, brands, all of that sort of stuff, Linux Foundation owns. And they now maintain it. There is a charter involved in doing that, which basically requires the organization of the project, how certain things are going to happen with regards to decision-making process, what they like to call the technical steering committee, which you can almost think of as the board of the project. The Linux Foundation has the ability to do monetization on projects as well. We have chosen not to do monetization on Apptainer, just because we wanted it to be, we didn't see a huge need to. We may change that at some point in the future, but we just didn't see a huge need to monetize on it for the project's benefit. And so you hand over everything over, you assign everything over to them. They come up with the charter, you agree to the charter, you assign the initial technical steering committee, which by the definition of the charter is the committers of the project. So those who have commit access, or those merging or responsible for merging PRs. Contributors, of course, are the people generating PRs. Committers are the people that are responsible for merging. The committers, whoever those committers are the people that are on the technical steering committee.
Excellent. Thank you for that.
Oh, and who is the technical steering committee? We should probably mention that as well. So we have a few different people on the technical steering committee. There's myself, there's Ian Kaneshiro, there's Cedric Clougé, there is Dave Dykstra from Fermilab, and Krishna Mariki from KLA.
Excellent. It's always good to know who's involved. Appreciate it. One of the other questions that I get quite often is Apptainer going to continue to be HPC focused, or are there other outside of HPC use cases that people are looking at?
I'm gonna take a stab at this, but I don't want to talk too much. But I think this is the last couple points that I may actually be relevant on as we start talking more about science and smarter things. I would say yes, Apptainer is going to be focused on the high performance computing side, but that doesn't mean that those are all the use cases that it is going to be used for. One use case that we're familiar already with people using it for is high security environments. And Singularity and Apptainer have some I actually did that. I called it Singularity and I corrected myself.
At least it wasn't me.
I made it totally smooth. You probably almost couldn't tell. But Apptainer and Singularity both have some very unique ways that it manages its containers in the image format. And that image format allows us to do things like cryptographic signing, verification, layering cryptographic signatures, as well as just encrypting that image. So only people who have the passphrase or the keys to that can actually unlock a container. So there's a lot of high security and high trust use cases around Apptainer as well. But the one thing I would just really just kind of end this with is, or this question with is, the name actually came from application container. And we see a big difference in terms of usage between service-focused containers and application-focused containers. And there's good use cases for both of those. And one thing that I personally believe in is always use the right tool for the job. And if you're bringing up high performance computing applications, MPI applications, X or GUI applications and whatnot, you can do it in a service focused container, but it's quite a bit more difficult. It's not designed specifically for that, where Apptainer absolutely is designed exactly for that. So it works very well at that.
Nice, thank you. So I have a question, and I'm gonna throw this one to Glenn just because it's gonna use one of his words that he introduced me to. So if I have a Docker container, how do I transmogrify, Glenn's word, that into Apptainer?
I'm going to try not to say the S word. So yeah, so having done that a lot and finding a lot of Docker containers being the predominant container format for a lot of the bioinformatics tools out there, we simply import it into Apptainer. We switched in my last job. We switched to Apptainer, I don't know, sometime end of last year, I think, and it replaced the S word flawlessly. So we just kept using the same commands and everything. Just we were able to import Docker containers into Apptainer easily. We also started using Podman more for Docker containers, just so we could get a daemonless process running essentially. So yeah, and so transmogrify is a little bit maybe heavy-handed because it seems to be a pretty easy process to get Docker containers running in Apptainer. But we ended up doing it a lot, and a lot of our workflows, we'll search. It's like if this is a Docker container, transmogrify it into an Apptainer container. So it's not that hard. It's actually pretty easy.
Excellent. So on that, let's get into the actual conversation that I think is going to be interesting today. And let's start talking about how people are using Apptainer today. So, I mean, this is really Dave, Glenn, how are life sciences leveraging containers and Apptainer?
I'd like to talk a little bit about that because I'd like to talk about that a little bit from a historical perspective, because I recently had kind of a bit of an epiphany as I was writing some documentation that the use case is kind of, it's changed around a little bit. It's a little bit different from what it was originally. So one of the things I always kind of try to stress is, and this is something I came to recently, is that there's a differentiation in the types of users between producers and consumers when it comes to containers. And I think when we first started, developing, when Greg first started putting together this, what was then Singularity and is now Apptainer, and he started getting the community together, there really wasn't a good way to ingest Docker containers in. And so if you were going to be a consumer of containers, you had to be a producer first. And so that was one, the way in which we wrote the documentation and everything was to start off with, how do you build a container? That's square one. And recently, in going through some of the old documentation that we put together and updating it, I had the epiphany that we had the entire documentation backwards. We needed to flip it all around and write an entire section on how you use containers first, and then have kind of almost as a footnote at the end. By the way, if you also want to build your own containers, there's a way to do that too, and here's how. So, and that's really, that's really a change, and it shows how the community has grown now, and how containers have been adopted to the point where if you want to use a container, 9 times out of 10, you don't need to start, writing a definition file or a Docker file or something. You just, the first thing you do is you go to Docker Hub or another registry, and you look around and you find the container that it is that you want to use, and you download it and use it.
Excellent. Glenn, do you have anything to add to
that? Yeah. So having tried to build a lot of bioinformatics tools over the years and having scars from it, I'm encouraged to see that a lot more researchers are not just using GitHub and posting their code, so it's easier to get instead of having to email somebody who left their postdoc to become a professor and can't be bothered to send you their code. So I'm really encouraged by that, even more so now that they're actually posting them as in containers. And a lot of and some of the more enlightened researchers, I think, will post both containers in Apptainer and Docker. And so it makes sharing containers, code, and scientific reproducibility much easier than it was before, because even compiling on different platforms, we know can come up with different results, right? As small as they may be. So I'm really encouraged by that. And then for users to, get other people's code. So it kind of goes both ways, sharing it from the original creator of the software, and then people who want to reproduce it and then pass it on. It's also easier for people to get, like researchers at my last org would come in and say, yeah, we got this code we want to run. And instead of the admins having to spend a week trying to build it, they can just spin it up a container and test it really quickly for them. Or they could just run it on the laptop and it's not on the HPC cluster. And so that runs a lot quicker too. So I see the pace of reproducible research picking up really quickly.
You just brought up a couple really good points. First off, the mobility and reproducibility of these containers. Something I said a lot in the past, and I know that there's certain, since we're talking bio, I know that there's certain pharmaceutical companies and bio-focused organizations and research that whenever workloads are being used clinically or software is being used clinically, it is actually, there's certain mandates according to the FDA that require that software stack is managed very similarly to a medical device. And I'm wondering, have either of you guys had similar experiences with regards to compliance? Maybe not specifically FDA, but compliance and legal mandates of reproducibility.
No, not me in particular. And, I think that probably because the NIH is a little bit more on the research side versus the actual, applied medical side. So if you got more into another agency, or more like a hospital setting, I think that you might get into that a little bit. But I don't know. That's just my experience. I don't know, Glenn, if you've seen those sorts of things in your experience.
Yeah, so we've at TGen we had several startups kind of be incubated and then spun out, and they were all clinical bioinformatics organizations, so diagnostic tests and other clinical sequencing. And the code there wasn't, it was locked down, but it wasn't in containers, right? They had an auditable process, but and this should come as no shock, it's actually the data that's actually more scrutinized with regard to compliance. How long are you going to keep it? Is it encrypted? Where is it going to be for the next 7 to 10 years or infinity? How can users contact you and have it deleted? So all those processes have to be sorted out, and the software was kind of the easiest thing to do. However, I would recommend, if someone had asked me, because a lot of these, orgs started before I got there, why don't we put it in containers so we could more easily, pass an audit? for example, right? And sign things, as opposed to just trusting that, the BWA version you downloaded 2 years ago is actually, doesn't contain any bad code or is, just a crummy version. So it's a big deal. It's going to be a bigger deal. I think as we try to get cover the last mile of software integrity. So there are companies out there that want to help researchers create encrypted enclaves in computer RAM so that their code, their data, and their models can't be altered even in DRAM. So I think using containers there will be a lot easier as well to help manage those encrypted enclaves.
So you also brought up the build infrastructure, and not directly, but the build process, I guess I should say. What I really like to see, and this was part of the reason why I was so excited about moving Singularity into the Linux Foundation, is because the amount of innovation and capability growth that has occurred with the rest of the ecosystem around containers is massive. And the fact that you can have Git operations feed into a CI/CD pipeline and automatically generate containers on a Git op, like a push or a tag, is truly remarkable. And the fact that you can then automate that entire pipeline and then automatically integrate that into your research is fantastic. So I'm really excited about that. Dave, to your point about flipping kind of the documentation upside down, totally agree. And I'd love to see more emphasis on how do we make use of CI/CD for container creation generation, and how can it be such that anybody who's a researcher, scientist, or creator, producer of these applications can automatically be creating these containers, and the format doesn't matter. I like OCI a lot because it works pretty much everywhere. Apptainer and Singularity both can leverage OCI directly, but you can also create CIF files and then even cryptographically sign those CIF files. And then the second point I just wanted to make really quick was as we're talking about reproducibility of these containers and portability of these containers, knowing where you got these containers is actually really important. Now, for the most part, we've all just been kind of ignoring this and not paying much attention to, like, there's a container up in Docker Hub. I'm just going to go ahead and pull it and use it and see how it works. There's a risk associated with that if you don't have validation of that to some extent. And we already have seen certain container viruses or malware going out there. There was one that I thought was hilarious, which was every time somebody ran a particular container, it started doing crypto mining on your own resources, but putting it into someone else's coin account. That was brilliant, but it was a malicious container, right? You didn't expect that to happen. We need to have some sort of management of provenance of these containerized workloads and trust of these. And I do think there's been a lot of forward progress moving out of OCI and CNCF around exactly this. So I'm really looking forward to that, and I'm looking forward to integrating that into Apptainer and making this even easier and better for users.
Thank you, Greg. So we do have one question, and does anyone on the panel have or envision a standard, and I'm going to say DOI this time and not DOI, Greg, since you fixed me last time, for containers? I.e., if you publish a paper, uses codes, systems for computation to share the code and those systems via DOI for a container.
You're kind of making me sound like the Homer Simpson, but it's DOI, right?
No.
But yeah, people use both, but I think the more common is DOI for that. But that's a great question. And this was one of the initial goals and motivation of a project called Singularity Hub, which was started early on through Singularity, and Vanessa created this project. And that was the goal behind that, is to basically have a place where you can post your container and have a UUID associated with that container such that anybody in a publication or wherever can basically reach out to there and touch that. Our previous company, Scilabs, David, myself, Ian, Cedric, and others, we're all in. We also had something very similar to that called the library. So there are solutions for this. And in an OCI, I mean, I see people now using Docker Hub almost as a DOI for their research papers and whatnot, and as a reference. I think we need to do more of that. I absolutely think we need to be doing more of that. So in every paper, every research paper, there should be if there's software associated, of course, there should be a link not only to the source code and recipe for how do they create their environment, but the actual containers that they used to generate that analysis. And again, going for reproducibility is so critical here. I don't think so. You can do there's multiple ways of registering and obtaining DOIs for various, for papers, for software releases and whatnot. I don't know if anyone is using the official DOI infrastructure for a container, but I'm going to ask Dave and Glenn if they have more, any more insight on that than I do.
So I don't know if anyone does, but I was just trying to quickly research. So GigaScience, the journal GigaScience, is kind of one of the leaders here, I think, in also providing like DOIs for data sets. So with the GigaScience, when you submit your paper, you also have to submit your data and make it available. And I believe that gets a DOI as well, separate from the article, but they're associated. So I'd like to see that type of registry for containers as well, because to Greg's point, and like what I mentioned before, it's one thing to have GitHub have your code and a link to your container, but will your GitHub account be around forever, right? Will you always have access to it if you move from place to place, or what happens if you want to take it, the software, and make a company out of it and shut some of it down and keep some of it open. So I think for that split second in time, that has to be fossilized in time, so that people can always go back to that point in time and not have to use whatever comes upstream of that. So so a Singularity hub kind of makes sense. You could have a separate hub, but then I think more journals should start requiring essentially DOIs for containers, and maybe we have to get a build process that's approved for journals as well. Like I could put up a container there that starts bit mining all your computers. So right. So and I make that joke, but I just realized the number of like illegitimate journals, right, that are out there now asking, requesting papers. I don't know if any of you guys have seen some of this stuff, but like some people have published just complete nonsense in these, online journals that, make themselves sound respectable. And it's, so if someone like falls for that, right, and just, puts their container up there, or, they start putting up a bunch of, malware filled containers, and then someone, not realizing that's not a really, legitimate journal, downloads that, then they're infected, right? Or then they're part of the, the bit mining thing. So, we might start needing somewhat of a process that's certified or certifiable, I guess, when we build containers before we put them up, before they're posted. And maybe that's something the NIH or NSF could be a part of. I don't know, but obviously it has to be a global kind of agreement. So I don't know if, the Sanger and the Broad get together and G4A, the Global Alliance for Genomic Health. They're big into API development. Maybe it's something that, they could jump ahead on and start thinking about.
I know, Dave, we kind of talked about this yesterday a little bit, having some sort of process behind it, and even kind of the beauty behind Apptainer is being able to do cryptographic signing so that you can ensure what's in there. I don't know if you want to share some thoughts on that.
Yeah, so my 2 points, so I've got a couple of points I'd like to make based on, so you sparked a couple of thoughts in my head when you were talking there, Glenn. So one of them is, going back to Mystic Knight's question, is there going to be, do we envision any standard for a DOI, kind of system? Well, the tools are all out there. That's kind of like in fact, there's multiple different ways already to do this. There's lots and lots of tools that are out there to ensure that you can use SHA-SUMs, you can assign and verify your containers. You can do things to make sure that you're getting bit-for-bit reproductions of the original container that the author intended. But I think what we really need is some more community agreement on what kinds of tools we're going to use and how we're going to implement those. And that's what's kind of missing right now, is that there's lots of tools, but it's kind of like the Wild West as far as how people decide to implement them, or whether they decide to implement them, or so on. So we need kind of like you were saying, Glenn, we need to get together and try to come up with some standards around this tooling, if this is going to succeed, if we're going to have this kind of infrastructure in place. And then my second point that you kind of sparked in my mind, and this is, I've said this before in some pretty public forums, so people have probably heard me talking about this in the past. But I'm going to get up on my soapbox for a second. I think most people understand this now, and it used to be that very few people understood this. But if you're interested in reproducibility, and you're interested in making sure you get exactly the same code base in your container every time, you cannot rely on a def file or a Docker file. You really have to have that container. You have to have those bits. And this was, I really got surprised one night. I mean, I have an anecdote that I often share. One night I was doing some testing on a TensorFlow container, and I was building the container and testing it, and building the container and testing it. And as I was doing this iteration, all of a sudden the container build stopped working, and I couldn't understand why. And it was because on Docker Hub, that tag had been removed that I was using. And so the internet is subject to change, and it's changing all the time. And your definition file is, the same definition file that you created 5 minutes ago might not work again. So if you really are interested in reproducibility, you have to have the container. Save the container. Don't save the file that created the container.
So I think what you're saying, Dave, is always use latest, no matter what.
Yeah.
No, I don't either. So here's actually a good question. So what about work during COVID or in COVID? How did that play out? Any thoughts on that, Glenn?
Yeah. So my prior employer, we sequenced like 70% of the COVID tests in Arizona, and we were set up for, our pipeline was set up very well, but it could have been improved. But because I saw all over the internet people posting containers specifically for viral genomics, and then they would tweak it and say, oh, it's but specifically for COVID, right? So it would probably contain reference COVID reference genomes or something like that, right? So and some projects became more prominent than others. Arctic was one project that was putting out lots of pipelines for COVID sequencing and analysis, and they were publishing them to, so the workflow orchestrator they were using was Nextflow. And Nextflow, I was a huge fan of, because years ago when Nextflow started, they adopted Singularity like a year after Docker, right? Like they supported Docker in like 2013, and then Singularity in like 2014 or 13 and 14, something like that. Really, or I might have, anyway, long time ago. And they support both still very, very well. And so the Arctic network was actually the labs that were publishing a lot of those pipelines put all that code in containers, just because it's obviously reproducibility was a big deal during a pandemic, right? When you've got people using pipelines created halfway around the world to do viral, genome analysis, so we can do, kind of the genomic epidemiology. So containers there, there wasn't really any question that that's what people had to do. And the only code I saw that wasn't in a container was, like from a publication, someone who had just figured out a new mutation or something like that, and they had their code that figured it out. But people who were spreading pipelines for other people to use, all the code was in containers.
Very nice. Dave, I don't know if you have anything to add to that as well about COVID.
Not really. I think that Glenn really captured the essence of that question and answer quite well.
All right, so
I've heard of various research organizations doing things, national labs and whatnot, doing research on it as well. And I've also heard anecdotally that a lot of that was happening through Singularity and Apptainer. But it's really cool to hear Glenn's specific experience in exactly working through that.
I mean, one of the things too that is so great about container technology is that it really it's enabling for researchers. And so at the NIH, a lot of the researchers build or use containers and do so without the explicit help of any administrators. And so because of that, I'm sure that there was a lot of enablement and that was happening kind of behind the scenes, that administrators didn't even have to deal with, because users were able to use the containers on their own.
Yeah. One more thing that you kind of remind me about it too. So with viral genomics too, the genomes are so small compared to human or other mammalians, or even lots of plants and things. A lot of these things can actually be done on a laptop. If you're just going to do one analysis, maybe not my laptop because it's a couple of years old, but so with containers, you could actually, go pull a, viral recon container or, something from Arctic and run a workflow on your laptop. And so that allowed, people who didn't have large HPC clusters to actually participate in, kind of the global effort.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We did have one question that just popped in. Yeah, could you comment on the pros and cons of container versus packages on Conda environments? Throw this up to whoever would like to take it. Anyone?
Yeah, I mean, a pro, a definite pro is that you can replace the Conda environment with the container. So yeah, Conda has become really, it's become pretty unwieldy. So it's gotten to the point where, so it used to be at the NIH, there's a big, huge like Conda environment that has lots of standard tools installed in it. And just, going through the dependency resolution step, it's gotten to the point where you actually need a cluster to run the dependency resolution step, because the memory is, requirements are such that they will crash your node. They're just too much. So yeah, so it's become completely unwieldy. And so yeah, I mean, now to be able to take those packages out of this big Uber Conda environment and just stick them in containers instead has been really kind of a huge win for us in HPC, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, I second Dave's comments. I felt the pain of trying to, the YAML environment YAML file to Conda and build everything, and takes hours. I'm like, you know what, delete and just not try to update it, right? Just create a whole new one. So I was huge fan of Conda, and working and talking with Peter back in the day, like the Continuum days and actually nthought days before Continuum. And it was a huge leap for Python and being able to be as a Python developer. But then I started getting worried when it became all of a sudden like a package manager for anything. Like you could install anything with Conda now. Like you could install R, you could install like Unix utilities. I'm like, oh, this is going to just be like this sprawl all over everywhere, and then just kind of get out of control. And that's kind of how I felt it happened. And so with our users, we've had this battle with, yes, you could have this environment. Yes, you have a list of things to do, but like making an incremental update to that takes hours to do, becomes less unwieldy. And we were trying to promote, look, if you just put a single app in a container, your pipeline will work. If you need a development environment, we tried to limit it, like you said, to keep the dependencies down, because like, Conda again can pull in everything, and like, let's just limit it to like, NumPy, SciPy, and the Python packages you need, and stop pulling in R and other things that really just make it just a real mess to deal with.
I mean, one thing too, I kind of feel bad because I just sort of trashed Conda and said that just replace it with containers is the way to go. One thing I will add to that is, I mean, Conda is a decent package manager when it's used for what it's meant to be used for. I think that one of the problems is that we kind of, and I think a lot of HPC sites probably did this, tried to make like a big Uber, Python environment based on Conda, and that maybe is not really what it was used for. Conda within containers is actually great. There have been many applications that I've installed where the developers have either instructions, or they have the files to package all their dependencies within Conda up on GitHub. And if I just want to grab that and stick that in a nice clean container environment with mini Conda or something, and then use that to install everything into the container, that a lot of times works really great. And then within the container, just figuring out where the Conda environment is and putting that on the path, or even just sourcing Conda and Conda activating it within the environment of the container. I mean, those things usually work just fine, and so it's usually pretty quick to use Conda to install something inside of the container. But if you do that, then you sort of modularize it so that you don't have this big Conda environment that's got a zillion different dependencies and they're all conflicting with each other, and how are you going to resolve them all? So I think the two working together can work together quite nicely if you do it maybe a little bit more in the way that Conda was intended.
Thanks, Dave.
I'm going to respond kind of in a very more general perspective. One of the really big benefits of containers, I mean, being able to isolate environments, being able to move things around is incredibly important. But the packaging format that we've just created, we basically just took packaging up a layer. Instead of packaging certain applications or services or files within an operating system, we're now actually using the package manager to help create that custom operating system. Then we're packaging the operating system and then moving that whole operating system around. So for me, containers is actually, I mean, again, it's a cool runtime. There's a lot of cool things you can do with having a separate isolated environment, but it's also a packaging system. And that packaging system is incredibly flexible because it is the user space of the operating system. So it has every single thing you need, and it's portable between whatever Linux distributions you want, as long as your architecture is binary compatible. You got an entire application set in a package, in a matter of speaking. So yeah.
I think you just preempted Jonathan's question too. I think if we could pop that one up. So have you seen any issues with reproducibility when running a container on a different kernel version? So I mean, you just talked about having a container with different packages in it. What about kernels?
Yes. Not only kernels, but hardware. So the idea of saying that a container is reproducible is not exactly true, depending on what perspective of reproducibility you're talking about. If you're talking about reproducibility of outcome, it's not guaranteed. Kernel bugs, driver bugs, firmware changes. We saw something not too long ago where a GPU firmware bug, I'm not going to talk about what GPU, but a GPU firmware bug was actually causing wrong answers. So these things do happen. Now, when we talk about reproducibility, though, from a container perspective, what we're talking about is reproducibility of the software stack. 100% guaranteed reproducibility of that software stack, of user space software stack. So some attention still has to be given to the underlying resource if you want to guarantee the entire, the reproducibility of the outcome. Generally speaking, though, most of us consider reproducibility of the software stack good enough. Most of us aren't thinking about kernel bugs, driver bugs, firmware bugs, hardware bugs. We're just assuming that all of that's going to work properly. And in the kernel specifically, the kernel has an incredibly stable, backwards compatible API, an ABI, that it's passing to the user space portion of the operating system. So generally speaking, it's something we can strongly count on. But again, yeah, things happen. And depending on what direction you're going, usually if you're going backwards, so if you've got a newer kernel and you want to run an older container, you can actually run really far back. Like that API is so stable. Zane, the story I could bring up from Berkeley. We actually had a system that was like 17 years old, and the hard drive died. We took the hard drive out, we made a container out of it, and that software continued to run in that 17-year-old operating system. So
fantastic.
Yeah, but you can't go the other way. If you've got an old kernel, and I mean, the extreme case is very easy to, all right, a 17-year-old kernel is not going to support namespaces, much less anything else. But if you even have a kernel that's, just, let's say 2 or 3 major operating system revisions late, if you wanted to run on CentOS 6, a new, let's say Rocky 8 or Ubuntu or a Fedora user space, it's not going to work. glibc is actually going to check, and you're going to get a glibc error. So the direction of compatibility needs to be considered in that. But generally speaking, knock on wood, usually we just say everything just kind of works.
So I have a quick question. So I've seen that glibc error. A lot of people have seen the glibc error when you've got some new version of the operating system and you try to run it within your container and your kernel's old. So I've seen that. I know in theory you could run a container on a different kernel and end up actually without like a syntax error, but actually have just a different answer. And I know in theory also with different hardware like a GPU, but I've never actually seen that. Has anybody ever actually seen that? I mean, it's obvious if you get the glibc error, it's great because it's just like, okay, well I can't, it's not going to run on this host. But it's a little scary if you have a math problem and you come up with a slightly different answer, But I've never actually seen. I know that's possible in theory, but has anybody ever actually seen that occur?
I've never seen it in person. I just know of people who know people that have seen it. And an example is, again, the GPU issues where people were getting wrong numbers. That came from another national lab, which I believe was the first ones who saw it. So I just knew people who knew people who have seen it. But that, you're exactly right. That's the one that scares me. Right. When it errors out and it's just not going to work, that's actually a good thing. When the error doesn't happen and it just silently gives you the wrong outcome, that's actually scary. It's actually also very difficult to debug. I've seen that happen a number of times in software with various math libraries and whatnot that were just for some reason just not given the right answer, or optimized differently, or loops were unrolled in a way that for optimization that yielded a wrong and not completely wrong, just slightly wrong error. That's almost as bad as you get the call from a scientist who says my application's running 5% slower than it did yesterday. What's going on? Now debugging that one is tricky too, but you're exactly right. I much prefer a error to a wrong answer.
Right.
Absolutely. And I think so, John, I don't know if we can pop this one up. John made an interesting statement. It would be nice for the language around reproducibility to make the distinction between developer reproducibility and scientific reproducibility. I think it's a good statement. I think we all agree.
100%.
Yeah, we should almost use different words, right? When you're talking about like reproducing an experiment versus reproducing a software stack.
True. So we're kind of getting close on time. And one of the things I really wanted to be able to have Dave and Glenn dive into real quick before we wrap up is common real world use cases that you guys see in life sciences or that you have seen and been a part of. Kind of just tell us what you were a part of, what you saw, and it would help me a lot because I like seeing real world examples and helps me.
Sure, I can jump in. So uh, at the NIH, there were different domains of science that picked up containers and are picking up containers at different speeds. But there's kind of like, and I've already differentiated that and kind of talked a little bit about that. There's two different kind of flavors of end users, the producers and the consumers. And what it all boils down to is that containers are just really enabling researchers to get their stuff done. It gives them more power and it gives them more convenience. And so we're seeing a lot of and that's the standard kind of use case is that we're seeing a lot of researchers just using containers to either have stuff prepackaged or to be able to use like apt or yum or whatever to install things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to install in their HPC environment. We're also seeing, a lot of people are using containers because they're using, workflow languages. Glenn already talked a little bit about Nextflow, but also things like Whittle and Cromwell and things like that that are using containers. That, and then even there are, well, I won't dive into that too much, but that's people are picking up on that more and are starting to use containers more for like orchestration, within like workflows and things, even within sciences. And so then that's from the user perspective, but then also from the administrative perspective, so at the NIH, it's kind of a little bit of a unique HPC environment because people talk about the long tail of HPC, and NIH is like entirely the long tail, right? I mean, there are 1,000 applications and growing that are installed on the cluster, which are maintained by staff, which is just a staggering number. So the staff members have really picked up on using containers, and it's now become the default, and the vast majority of new applications that are installed on the system are just containerized. And we put together, I think there's a few different ways to do this. There are different levels of automation, but we put together a pretty, easy way for staff to just install a container, write a little wrapper script. In fact, in many cases, just copy a boilerplate wrapper script into the same directory, and then make symlinks to all the binaries and things that they want to expose inside the container. And then after that's all done, it can be put under the module system, just like any other application. And the end result is that staff very easily install these applications in containerized ways, and users come along and use them as though they're installed directly on the system and never even know what a container is. And so that's a really big use case that we're seeing as well.
That's interesting. I'm just going to touch on that before Glenn jumps in. When we were first developing Singularity's image format, and we basically decided that we're going to make it a loop-based file system, an actual file system, and squash all of the contents into that file system. And it was a single file. I forget how the idea entered into our heads, but at some point somebody said, it's a single file. Can't we just execute that? And we actually talked about how to actually run and make that single file system executable. And when we first figured out how to do it, we realized, oh man, it was actually much easier than we thought it was going to be, as we're using a crude hack of the shell to do it. But with that being said, you can literally build a Singularity or an Apptainer container, define a run script for that container, put it in your path, and then that becomes your application. The fact, David, you kind of just talk through that real high level, but the magic that actually creates and what it does is actually super, super, super cool. So just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah, to me, that's always a fun use case just because Python virtual environments can get kind of ugly. So being able to do that, it's magic.
Yeah, I second Dave's experience at the NIH with our cluster. You know, we're struggling with modules and then trying to bring containers into it. And I thought it was this ugly hack, but then I thought it was kind of like Greg was saying, was really brilliant. It's just like, well, why don't we just, write, when they load the module, they just load a container instead of like the binary that we used to build for them. And I'm like, that's really just this ugly hack. Why can't we? I'm like, oh yeah, the inertia of using modules. We can't get people just to change their scripts to use containers. And so that's actually how we're kind of, sliding in these containers a lot onto our cluster. The other thing that we thought containers were going to be really kind of required for. So there's folks that I was working with that wanted to basically be the future of HPC was going to be cloud native. And now that didn't necessarily mean you were going to run in a public cloud, but you basically needed to be able to, as one of my colleagues would say, run my stuff anywhere, anytime, right? And so the only way you can really do that with is containers. And so when we were experimenting with a lot of our pipelines, trying to run them in the cloud, we thought that containers were the only way we were going to be able to reproduce anything, but it was the only way we were going to be able to be kind of like because everyone wanted to be multi-cloud and cloud agnostic and just, throwing out all the, let's be vendor neutral terms. I stopped using the word cloud and started using the word serverless because I just got tired of, what cloud was meaning, because it could mean VMware, it can mean GCP, it could mean, lots of other things. So I think containers are kind of going to be the key to cloud native computing. And we predicted this and we've started seeing this. So then the newer hires at TGen, the faculty members kind of expect like, so where's your AWS account? Like, how come I can't just spin up this, my instance there? How do I get this? And so we kind of predicted that, as users are using containers and being more cloud native, because they could be the long tail of HPC and not running on big HPC clusters, they just expect to be able to spin this up. That's going to be, that the researchers are going to eventually just start demanding it when they go to be recruited by an institute, right? It's like, so how am I going to be able to compute here? Is it traditional HPC, or am I going to, everything I have is out in the cloud. My petabyte of data is out there. How am I going to keep doing my analysis that I got hired for? I'm not downloading it here, right? So how do you help me, get my stuff out there under whatever organization's account, right? And if this organization doesn't have an account with this cloud provider, how do I make it happen? So I think that's something that we've just started to see the tip of the iceberg on, but we expect it to happen just because of container usage, Conda usage, and more what I like to call just, container or serverless kind of based computing.
The only thing I'd add on top of that, by the way, I think that was 100% accurate. The only thing I'd add is I think containers are really the necessary next step for any form of more modern high performance computing as we're looking forward. Whether you want to just run in the cloud and you want to be able to move your workflows effectively and whatnot, instead of rebuilding your whole software stack up in the cloud, it's just so much easier and more convenient just to containerize that software stack and now be able to run it portably anywhere.
Absolutely. I think it also kind of, as I'm hearing Glenn talk, it reminds me very much of what fuzzball was intended for. So I start thinking fuzzball immediately. So thank you guys. We are at the end of our time, and I really appreciate you guys joining today. Very informative. And anybody out there, if you have any questions, please reach out to us. Give us a like and subscribe. Follow us every week, and we are looking forward to talking to you again. Thanks for joining, guys.
It's fun. Thanks.
Thanks.